Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Daniel McAdams is with me today, and it's good to see you, Daniel.
Good to see you, Dr. Paul. Good morning.
I'd like to talk today a little bit about some various events going around the world, because there's a lot of propaganda out there, a lot of threats and intimidations, and sometimes I think we just invite it because we're involved in so many places. But we heard the story about the Chinese are coming. The Chinese are coming. Are they going to invade Alaska? And we want to, try to put the proper balance on that. And of course, there's always propaganda how the Ruskies are about to invade. And I haven't seen them getting ready for a beachhead, and I haven't seen the Russians doing what the Soviets did on putting missiles down in Cuba. And of course, we read the story about us placing drones in Latvia. So it's on and on. And the question is these war drums beating? Are they real, or is it imaginary? Is it propaganda, or should we ignore it? Let's start with the headline about China putting ships near Alaska. What kind of significance can we place on that?
Well, I think there is one, and you might say that they're sending a signal. I think there's a strange symbiosis among the Beltway think tanks and the Chinese military, because CSIS, for example, which is a Beltway think tank that gets a lot of defense money, one of their experts said the Chinese Navy is going global. It's a big threat. They're right off our shores, and of course that might be a departure. But I was looking in July, the U.S. launched a major littoral combat ship that they said is going to be great because it's going to be patrolling the South China Seas.
Yeah, well, I think they want to let everybody know that they're not a bunch of wimps and they don't want to get pushed around. I'd like them to react more like the Swiss react. They don't have to. They're not so insecure that they have to show they're strong, and yet they've been able to defend themselves. But that's not yet to come, and of course we have to deal with the constant antagonisms between Russia and the United States. In spite of the fact that we depend on Russia to go to the space station, it amazes me that we go back and forth. But I would call it provocative for the United States to put drones, not a ton of them, but right on the borders of Russia and Latvia. And I don't know if you noticed, but the people who were going to man these drones was Texas Air National Guard. I thought they were supposed to be here protecting us or something,
Texas.
But here we have the Air National Texas Guard over in Latvia. It seems like the Russians should have a little bit to complain about on that.
You think about it in a sense. The Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia being in NATO confirmed the worst fears of Russia, why they didn't want them to join NATO, which is they didn't want offensive military weapons on their border. And this is exactly what the case is. And of course, CNN, I was reading earlier, talking about this, and they portray it as that this is in response to Russia's actions in Ukraine. Whether you believe they invaded or not, there's not been much evidence of it, but in what way does it affect the U.S.?
Yes, and we have to question exactly where some of the information comes. In particular, the stirring the pot about the Russians ready to send the troops, battle-ready troops to Syria. Big announcement, and then the next day it was denied. And I'm sure Russia has an interest in Syria. They have a station there, and we know they're sympathetic to Assad. But the way the headlines were written was that they were sending implied combat troops. But then when we looked around to find out where they got this information, all of a sudden it was a single source, and it was not very thorough in telling us exactly who knew these troops were on their way to Syria.
There was a fellow by the name of Fishman, and he wrote for a news site called Ynet, which is an Israeli news outfit. And if you look through the original article, which was copied by many other articles, many other publications, there really was no sourcing for it. It was all unnamed sources, but it was very scary. Thousands of Russians ready to land in Syria. Interestingly enough, we talked about the Chinese. This also, in a way, appeals to both the U.S. neocons and the super pro-Russia people who think Russia's going to save the day. And both of them have a lot of wishful thinking that I think clouds their analysis and doesn't let them see things. So they're reading into this what they want to, but I certainly have seen no evidence. I think even the U.S. military a spokesman said that there's really no evidence that they.
Well, I don't think we're at a point where, you know, in a short period of time, a week, a month, or a year, that you're going to see massive movement of troops. Matter of fact, I'm not even sure that's ever going to happen again like it did in World War I and World War II. But I can see the world becoming more dangerous, and these para-government forces, you know, the independent sources and the terrorist approach as a reaction to what we do. I think that's going to continue. But we will see the propaganda building up, mainly to put fear. Fear is always a driving force. It's a political tool that people use, but it's also a political tool used to enhance people who make profits. But the danger that I see is that they don't have control of it. Yeah, let's go back and forth here. The Russians aren't going to do this. We still do business with them. We still can travel there. They're not going to do it. But someday something might get out of hand. And as conditions worsen, you know, yesterday we talked about the mass migration into Europe, which is like an explosion, an invasion, and destabilizing. And then, of course, the wars aren't ending in the Middle East, so this continues. So it would not be too difficult to see some of this stuff getting out of control and having an unintended consequence or a false flag, even if maybe there's somebody in our government or some other government and said, well, let's do this, and this will justify an escalation. So that to me is what I think is the real danger.
Well, I think, you know, as the interventions fail one after the other, we see now Libya, that was supposed to be easy. We see Iraq was supposed to be a cakewalk. We see Syria was supposed to be a smooth transition to democracy. But as these fail, I think there's some desperation that sets in, because I don't think there really is an articulated strategy of the United States for foreign policy. But I think, unfortunately, and you've said this before, and this desperation comes out in something like we talked about yesterday when Petraeus says maybe we need to ally with al-Qaeda. The sad thing is what you've always said, when this crisis comes, they're probably not going to immediately turn to us and turn to you and non-interventionism. First, they may turn to someone like Petraeus and go even further down the path toward disaster.
And that's what it sounds like, the fact that Petraeus is getting this much attention. You'd think maybe he had discredited himself a little bit, but no, they still look to him. And he, of course, was claiming, and others claimed, that he solved the problems of Iraq and brought about, you know, a peaceful settlement when they had the escalation and the surge. And also, though, he was very much involved in the CIA when the difficulties started in Ukraine, when an elected government was thrown out. Yeah. So you're right, they go back to these same people again, and there's further escalation. And I think sometimes it's difficult. I don't think I personally can say that these war drums are not real at all. Forget about them. Yeah. And but I don't think they're imaginary either. You know, I think there's stuff going on, and I worry about the unintended consequences and things getting out of control and not knowing exactly what the other side might do, because it can change rather suddenly.
You know, one of the solutions in Syria is really to do what you've said all along in Iraq, which is to just come home. You know, we don't have troops on the ground there, but if we would stop trying to prop up an imaginary force over another imaginary force, if we'd step back, maybe Syria would look to Iran. We certainly wouldn't have to encourage it, but if we step back out of there, there would be a solution to the problem. ISIS would be defeated in one way or another. And maybe some of these people that have gone to Europe might come back and help rebuild their country.
You know, there was a very famous person in our recent history, George Kennan, foreign policy expert. He was sort of the realist leader, and he was considered the author of Containment. And the conditions back then might have made a stronger argument for containment, even though I wouldn't have agreed with all the foreign policy. But it was, you don't invade Russia, but you contain Russia and stuff. But at least he was very well known for that. But as he got older, and I know you're very much aware of this, when he got older, he was writing things different. And one of his statements, it was rather interesting. He says, yes, he says, we still have to deal with containment. We have to contain the United States. And he was putting the blame, he would be a very interesting person to interview today, wouldn't he? To talk about containment. He probably wouldn't agree with our total non-intervention, but he would, I bet we could find a lot to agree with, that we need to contain some of our policies, like why are we putting drones in Latvia? You know, maybe it's time to do more talking.
And they'd want to tag us. We're always complaining about the U.S. We're somehow anti-American, unpatriotic. But it is patriotic to contain the un-American instincts of a globalist foreign policy, of the military-industrial complex that's impoverishing us and irritating the rest of the world. They're not making us any safer.
Right. I think we're more or less on a collision course in many areas in the world today, because I've said many times that the Keynesian economic model doesn't work. The model that we have for foreign policy of constant intervention and spending and deficit, that doesn't work either. But the world's been engulfed by our policies and our influence, both with our military and our influence, because we have the reserve dollar. So if we'd have spent a lot more energy, voluntarily of course, to probably convince more people, say in Africa, to accept the ideas of liberty and free markets, maybe we could have had a Hong Kong or something like that that could develop in Africa. But instead we have this failed system, and this leads to then the breakdown, and we ended up with you know, competing devaluations and protectionism, and also mass migration. So this is what we're up against right now. And then this leads, because people are getting poorer, and it's very popular politically in this country as well as elsewhere, to be a populist. I'm going to take care of the people, you know, without changing policy, just more government redistribution of wealth. And we're in the midst of that, and they're not really considering seriously a policy that makes sense, which would be free markets and individual liberties. So the protectionist model usually ends up into, you know, war propaganda. If we just spent more money on weapons, we'll get out of this mess. But then there are some people who actually believe the answer to this is war. People still believe that we got out of the Depression because we killed millions of people in World War II. What an answer. But there are people who believe that, and too often this set of standards go and they move us in that direction. That first you hear these problems, the economic problems, and you lead to military problems, and then you have a military interventionist foreign policy that we have that just aggravates and makes the Middle East chaos, and whether it's just in the Middle East or Ukraine or wherever, leads to a very, very dangerous situation. So yes, this talk of war and the militarization of other countries now is serious. I think we have enough time to bring some common sense to people. So what we need to do is work much harder to present the case for liberty and free markets and get away from this dependency on more government, more spending, and more war. That is what is dangerous, and that's not what America is all about. Hopefully so. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.